Welcome to the Legal Insurrection podcast. I'm Kimberly Kay, and I'm here with the Legal Insurrection Foundation president and founder, William Jacobson. And we have a very special guest. I'm super excited about our episode today and the discussion that we're about to have. We have Dr. Gad Saad, who's currently a visiting professor and global ambassador at Northwood University in Michigan. Professor Saad has pioneered the use of evolutionary psychology in marketing and consumer behavior. His works include The Consuming Instinct, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, Evolutionary Psychology and the Business Sciences, along with more than 75 scientific papers, many at the intersection of evolutionary psychology and a broad range of disciplines. His show, The Saad Truth, has garnered nearly 50 million views and downloads, and he's appeared on countless high-profile shows, including 11 times on Joe Rogan's podcast. Elon Musk is an avid supporter of his work, and Dr. Saad often writes and speaks about idea pathogens that are destroying logic, science, reason, and common sense. His fourth book, The Parasitic Mind, was released in 2020. It has since become an international bestseller, and his fifth book, The Saad Truth About Happiness, was released in 2023. And his forthcoming book is entitled Suicidal Empathy. So, welcome to our podcast. I'm so excited about this. I have long followed you on Twitter, now X, or whatever it is that we're calling it. And I do want to give a shout out to your book, The Parasitic Mind, which I read very recently. By far one of the best things I've read in a very long time. So, to anyone tuning in or listening or watching, definitely take the time to read that. It was very enlightening, even though we work in this space all the time and have for years. I really appreciate your take on some of the things that we'll discuss today. And I really love what you're tweeting and discussing, at least on social media, about suicidal empathy as well. So all of that to say, we're very, very glad to have you here today.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
I am also thrilled. I do want to give you fair warning. The difference between Kimberly and myself and the questions we may ask. She read your book. I read your tweets. That's the difference in our personalities. And I am thrilled to have you because really, I think many people think of you as kind of Paul Revere, warning that the regulars are coming. Not the British. He didn't say the British are coming. He said the regulars are coming, and really warning us. And what prompted me to really follow you more closely than I had been in the past was a tweet. And I think we'll put that tweet up on the screen momentarily. And it was from June of 2024. Remember, war is coming to every corner in the West. It might take 5 days, 5 years, or 50 years, but it's coming. The West has committed the greatest self-immolation in human history. Save this post. I did save it. I not only saved it, I wrote a blog post about your tweet. Tell us what you mean by that. I've got my own take, but we'd like to hear yours.
Right. So I think one of the difficulties that people have is what I call the ability to extrapolate from current trends, because that oftentimes is very ominous, right? And so one of the things that I talk about in the parasitic mind is what I call ostrich parasitic syndrome, which is, of course, the idea that the ostrich doesn't do this, but it's become a metaphor for someone who wishes to ignore reality, bury your head in the sand, and hopefully the problem goes away. Now, one of the ways that you usually solve a problem is you first recognize that you have the problem, right? I mean, if you go to see your physician and God forbid he or she says that you've got cancer, and your answer is, well, there is no such thing as cancer, and if there is such a thing as cancer, it's probably a Jewish conspiracy, so I'm not going to take it seriously, well, then you're probably going to die of cancer while you negate the fact that you have cancer. And so I think that the spirit of that tweet, at least the somber element of it, or the indignant element of it, is that here are these patterns that people should be picking up, but they merely go to the abyss of infinite lunacy, completely unconcerned with what any thinking person should be able to, connect the dots. Look, it I get so angry at it that I have to take a deep breath. I come from Lebanon. In Lebanon, everybody lived nice and happily until they didn't, right? But it's because Lebanon had a certain set of realities that the end result could only result in civil war, which is to have a perfectly tribal society where everything is rooted in which religious group you belong to. And for a while, it could go along nice and peacefully, but the end outcome, the extrapolation, has to be that you're going to end up in a debauchery of civil war. So when I predicted in 5 years or 50 years or whatever it is, 500 years, all I'm saying is the the markers are playing out in front of our eyes. For example, if you let in millions of people into your country through open door immigration policies, and these people do not share any of your foundational values, it probably doesn't take a fancy professor to put it all together for you. It might take a long time, right? In some cultures, it only takes 5 seconds for the thing to blow up. In some cultures, it might take 500 years, but it will happen. And so that's really the general gist of that tweet.
And a lot of people want to dance around what the problem is. Okay. And I know on Twitter, because that's mostly how I know you, there is a lot about the fact, the, Islamization of Western Europe, particularly, and whether that is, compatible with those societies. And people don't want to talk about that. Okay. People are afraid of getting called names. But when I read what you're writing, it kind of reminds me of Reagan's, rendezvous with destiny speech. We have a rendezvous with destiny. We preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. And that's what I think of when I read a lot of what you tweet, that we are at a point, and you see it in Paris, you see it in London, you see it in other places, um, and you frequently tweet about a 1,400-year history that people don't want to address. So perhaps you could explain to the people who will be watching and listening to this, what is our rendezvous with destiny as it's materializing now, in your view?
So in chapter 7 of the Parasitic Mind, I have the chapter is titled How to Seek Truth. And at first it's going to seem as though I'm not answering your question, but trust me, believe in the process, I will tie it all together. So nomological networks of cumulative evidence is an epistemological tool that I use when I'm trying to convince my most aggressive interlocutors of a particular position. So for example, if I want to convince you that toy preferences are not socially constructed, that there is a biological based element to that, how would I go about doing that? Well, I can get you data from around the world, from across time periods, from across species, from across methodologies, all of which triangulate to the fact that there is a universal sex specificity to toy preferences. Now, I'm going to take that methodology and apply it to, is Islam a peaceful religion? And hence, do we have 1,400 years of history that either supports that it's peaceful or not? Well, in building such a nomological network of cumulative evidence, there's all sorts of data that I can get for you. So for example, I could do a content analysis of the canonical content of the religion to see how often does it call for brotherly love versus kill, kill, kill. There is an answer to that. We could know what it is, right? We don't have to listen to George Bush and Barack Obama telling us that Islam is peaceful. We could look at historically how have religious minorities fared once Islam comes in. We could look at data that explore which countries have apostasy death penalties. We could look at data that say in which countries do women have the least amount of freedom. We could look at countries where we see where are gays most likely to be put to death, and on and on and on. So I don't have to engage in emotional incontinence or hysteria in order to prove my point. I simply build you a nomological network. And then hopefully, if you're an intellectually honest person, you will let the evidence sway you one way or the other. So when it comes to meeting our destiny, as per Ronald Reagan's quote, there's really almost nothing as clear, short of the existence of gravity, that where Islam goes, personal freedoms are eroded. Now, that doesn't say anything, and I hate to preface this because it really actually offends me. But I'm going to preface it for the imbeciles who might be listening. That says nothing about individual Muslims, right? I am friends with more Muslims than most people will ever meet in their lives. We're talking about Islam as a codified ideology in the same way that we know what communism is or what libertarianism is. Does Islam consist of a set of ideas that are consistent with Western values? If the answer to that is yes, then we should let in more Islam into the West. If the answer to that is no, then maybe we need to revisit our open door, immigration policy. Nothing could be clearer than that.
Yeah. I'll turn this over to Kimberly in a second, but how do you weigh that reality, that historical and present day reality? And I've always said, I have never written a word about Islam as a religion. I don't know enough about it. I would just be taking somebody's talking points. But to understand what's going in the world, you don't need to be a religious scholar. You simply need to read the news. Okay. And you need to see what happens throughout the world, whether it's Christians being beheaded in Nigeria, the genocide against Christians in the Middle East, obviously the attempted genocide against Jews. I think we're afraid to tell the truth, and I think a lot of what's going on is essentially a war on truth. But how do you weigh that reality against the United States Constitution, which guarantees to each person freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion? And that's one of the dilemmas that I personally feel trapped, because I don't want to ignore those constitutional freedoms. They are what sets us apart from the rest of the world, but we can't ignore the reality. How do you frame it when people say, well, you can't limit immigration of a group, freedom of religion? What's your take? Not necessarily as a constitutional scholar, not as a legal matter, but as a practical matter.
Right. Well, it's funny that you asked me this, because recently I had appeared on Will Kane's podcast where he exactly raised this point, and I'm going back on his show later today, his television show, and we're going to be addressing exactly that. So I'm glad that you said that I don't need to weigh in on the weeds of the legal game, because you're the lawyer, not me. But I can certainly weigh in using reason and logic and common sense. We can't be so impotent as to simply say, since we've got this thing called freedom of religion, therefore the word religion exists, therefore voila, there's nothing we can ever do. So let me give you a few examples. Fido the house cat is a feline. The adult male lion in the African savanna is also a feline. They're both called feline, yet I'm probably not going to be as likely to cuddle up with both of them. If I said that because they're both felines, let me get out of the Africa Jeep, the safari Jeep, and cuddle up with the male lion, that's probably going to be a categorization error that I made that's going to lead to me becoming someone's dinner, right? Here's another analogy. The MMA is a sport and badminton is a sport. They're both called sports, yet they don't have equal capacity to lead to brain injuries, but they're both sports, right? So we, in the Constitution, we have these things called amendments, because it's a living thing. It evolves, it changes. So the fact that you have this thing called freedom of religion doesn't mean that forevermore we are bound to those words, as it leads us to the abyss of infinite lunacy. We're also adaptable creatures that can adjust in light of incoming evidence. Jainism is a perfectly peaceful religion. It is so peaceful that when Jains walk on the sidewalk, they walk with a broom to make sure that they don't step on any ants. So, an extremist Jain is an extremely peaceful person. A fundamental Muslim is not so much. So it certainly can't be that the West's existence rests on its impotence of, but there is freedom of religion. So, there's really nothing we can do about it.
No, I
I've
think
got
you make a great. Oh, go
Kimber.
ahead.
No,
No,
turn
I
it
was
over to
gonna,
you.
okay. I was going to say, I think you make a great point about the distinction between individuals who might engage in Islam and then the universe of it itself. So I grew up in Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country by population. And like you, had many, many, many Muslim friends with zero issue. But then the flip side of that was that we also had friends who, if they converted to Christianity, could never see their parents again or they would be killed. So you're dealing with very different pieces and very different facets of this universe of Islam. Um, One of the things I would like to hear from you, and I think our listeners and viewers would be very interested to hear too, and I know you explained this, at least the Cliff's Notes version of it in your book, The Parasitic Mind, but kind of how you ended up where you are. I know you have a very harrowing but very fascinating story about how you ended up exiting Lebanon, but even just from a career perspective, how you ended up working in the space that you're working now and speaking so boldly about the things that you speak about now.
Thank you for that question. So I basically tell the following story about my life. I have faced two great wars in my life. The first great war was the Lebanese Civil War, a literal war, a war of butchery by which all other wars of butchery are judged against. And hence, that's why when the tweet that Bill mentioned earlier, where I said, it'll be on every street corner in 550 or 500 years, it's because that's exactly what it was in Beirut, right? You lived in peace until every street corner, house to house, people were butchering each other once, the lid, fell off, so to speak. That Lebanese civil war, our unique reality stemmed from the fact that we were part of the last remaining group of Jews, not Druze, not Druze, but Jews, Jews. They sound almost phonetically the same. So we were part of a very small community of Jewish people, Lebanese people, Arabic speaking people, right? We're fully Arabic in our culture. We just happen to be Jews. It became impossible to be Jewish in Lebanon. And so, at immediate threat of execution, we were able to leave Lebanon. And if you want later, I can certainly share some of the stories of Jew hatred that I experienced even before the Civil War started. So that was the first great war that I faced, which was a very traumatic, childhood to grow up under. As you might imagine, my parents were kidnapped by Fatah. They were tortured. Some really bad things happened to us. So it's really, I mean, if you want to talk about real victimology, I don't have to manufacture a victimology story. I, I'm at the apex of victimology, but I have overcome that, right? And I stand here before you, not as a victim, but as someone who, despite that tragic start to my life, have hopefully done something positive with my life. The second great war, which speaks to the rest of your question, was the war on reason, on logic, on science, on reality that I experienced being now a professor for 31 years. Now, where I first saw that war on reason was in my scientific work, where I was trying to Darwinize the business school. By Darwinize the business school, what I mean is to incorporate evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology in the study of human behavior in general and economic and consumer behavior in particular. To me, it seemed self evident that, of course, human beings are biological beings. Who wouldn't know that? Well, I'm here to tell you that most of my social scientist colleagues till today don't agree with me and think that it is a really dangerous thing to argue that human beings are driven by evolutionary forces. Evolution applies to every species on Earth except one, called Homo sapiens. And if evolution does apply to Homo sapiens, it stops at the neck. It doesn't go higher. So it might explain why evolution might explain why you have opposable thumbs. But surely, Dr. Saad, you're not one of those Jewish Nazi doctors who believes that we apply evolution to study the human mind. We transcend our biology. We're cultural animals, according to social scientists. And so that was my first exposure to sort of the what the F moment. How could these people actually believe that we transcend our biology? I mean, you think my hormones don't affect my behavior when I make decisions? You think my hunger state doesn't affect my behavior, in terms of which decisions I will make if I'm hungry or not? And so what to me seemed self-evident was terribly controversial, and it continues to be terribly controversial in the social sciences. So those were the two original places where I faced some variant of a war, either a physical war, or a war on reason. And the unique attributes that make up my personality don't allow me to be quiet. In other words, I never modulate what I'm going to say, because you said, how come you speak so boldly and so on? I don't know how to be anything other than what I am, in that I don't have a strategic mindset that says, well, I better not tweet this because there might be these repercussions. Because the greatest cost to me would be me criticizing myself for being fraudulent. And for me, if I modulate my thoughts, if I modulate what I say, when I go to bed at night, I can't sleep because there was an attack on truth and I cowardly walked away from defending it. And therefore, I worry less about the external enemies than I worry about my own self-criticism. And therefore, I stand and talk, and I don't give a damn what people think.
You're in good company there. Oh, so no, thank you for that. Thank you for answering that and for your explanation there. What do you
Yeah,
have, Bill?
yeah,
I know you have some burning questions before.
sure. So you introduced me to the concept of the wood cricket. I actually had to Google it and look up. Explain what your wood cricket.
Yes.
I don't know if it's an analogy or it's a insult, but explain it.
It's both. It's both. Some of my best insults are quite poetic in nature. People say that I can tell you to go to hell, and you look forward to the journey. Uh, so look, in a sense, I mean, I will use the wood cricket as the example, but in a sense, your question is, why is the book called The Parasitic Mind? Because the wood cricket is a manifestation of these neuroparasites. So I'll answer the more general question first, and then I will give the specific example with the wood cricket. So, as I was trying to come up with a framework to explain how it could be that human beings could be so zombified in their ideological capture, I started scouring the animal literature, which is exactly what an evolutionist would do, because oftentimes when you're trying to argue that some human behavior is evolutionary based, you look for homologies, equivalences in other species, right? So when I mentioned earlier about toy preferences, it turns out that sex specificity of toy preferences of human infants is the same as it is for rhesus monkeys, vervet monkeys, and chimpanzees. Well, surely you can't argue that the parents of rhesus monkeys are engaging in patriarchal sex typing, right? And so that must suggest that there is some innate evolutionary based mechanism that's driving those toy preferences. Well, so I took this idea and I said, well, let me now look at the parasitology literature. The parasitology is simply the study of host parasite interactions, but a parasite could be in your intestinal tract. So a tapeworm will parasitize your intestinal tract. I was looking for neuroparasites. So these are actual parasites that go to a host's brain, altering its circuitry and hence subsequent behavior to suit the interests of the parasite to the detriment of its host. And that's when I had my aha epiphany moment. Aha, I will now use this neuroparasitological framework to argue that human beings can be parasitized by idea pathogens. Now, specifically the wood cricket. The wood cricket abhors water. It wants nothing to do with water. When it is parasitized by a hairworm, the hairworm needs the wood cricket to jump into water so that it could complete its reproductive cycle. So the hapless, poor, zombified, parasitized wood cricket will happily jump and commit suicide in the service of the reproductive interests of the hairworm. Therefore, hashtag queers for Palestine is a wood cricket, because when my queer identity is the manner by which I most want to present myself to the world, would it make more sense for me to support a society that is unbelievably queer friendly called Tel Aviv, for example? By the way, that's literally true. Short of New York City, San Francisco, Montreal, Tel Aviv is right up there amongst some of the most queer friendly places in the world. Or should I put all my chips behind Gaza, where I'm happy to report to both of you that they have discovered through their very powerful psychoanalytic procedures, a new gravity based conversion therapy to solve your queerness. It's called "We Throw You Head First Off Buildings," the tallest buildings, because, oh, by the way, it's inscribed in Islam. So if I am a wood cricket queer person, should I go with Tel Aviv or should I go with Queers for Palestine? Well, because I studied at Wellesley and therefore I am much more enlightened than the rest of you, I put up a sign that says Dykes for Palestine.
You know, it's funny. This is why you're such a good guest, because you're always one step ahead of me. I want to hold this up. My next question was about queer. How do you explain queers for Palestine?
I have
Sorry.
to throw in there though, like really quickly.
All right, I'm
I
done with questions. You've answered everything. No, just joking.
no,
But
we were
your wood.
real quick.
Okay.
Can I pop in real quick
Yeah,
before
sure.
you get
Yeah.
there? To the wood cricket specifically, I don't even know how we got here. My kids have questions about things we watch on YouTube. There's videos of anything and everything, some good, some bad. We were looking up something about spiders. It served up something about this wood cricket parasite thing. We literally watched this like 3 days ago. It is terrible. It is just like the whole, it's disgusting. So, I mean, this analogy speaks, to something very, very awful in
Well,
every way.
and sorry, just forgive me for
Mhm.
interrupting you.
Yeah.
It's very powerful because it literally is. If you remember, I mean, I'm old
Mhm.
enough, and I think Bill is old enough to remember the movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Yes,
Yes.
Right. Well, this is
the original one.
invasion. Right. It's invasion of the mind snatchers, right? Because
Yes.
that's what makes it so apt. Because how else can you explain such behavior, right? I mean, how else can you explain such an orgiastic desire to self-immolate? To go back to my earlier tweet that Bill so kindly put up. I mean, it has to be a form of parasitic zombification. There's nothing else that could explain it.
Okay,
Yes.
but you've identified the wood cricket. It's mostly Western society. But what is the parasite?
Right, great question. So, in the parasitic mind, I discuss a whole bunch of these ideological parasites. I mean, I could discuss as many as you want, but I'll start with the granddaddy of all parasitic ideas, and that's postmodernism. Because postmodernism, I call it intellectual terrorism, right? Because up is down, slavery is freedom, war is peace, men are women, left is right. And why is that? Because it purports, it meaning postmodernism, that there are no objective truths, other than, of course, the one objective truth that there are no objective truths. And it is that parasitic idea that then offers the affordance for the other parasitic ideas to flourish, right? So, for example, I have another parasitic idea called social constructivism. Social constructivism is the idea that we are all born tabula rasa without any innate biological imperatives, and it is subsequently only socialization that makes Bubba bench press more than Linda. It can't be, because there is actually an innate physiological, anatomical, morphological, hormonal difference between this thing called male or female. Plus, we don't know what this thing called male or female is, as your most recent addition to the Supreme Court explained to us, because she didn't have the epistemological assuredness to tell us what is a woman, because she's not a biologist, but she's going to sit on cases involving these real creatures called women, which, by the way, until 15 seconds ago, the 117 billion people that had existed on Earth, that's a real estimate. There have been about 117 billion Homo sapiens. They all seem to have been able to completely navigate through the conundrum of what is male or female. But now we no longer know that. And that's why we celebrate when the British courts explained to us just yesterday that no, there is a definition for women. But your ancestors and mine didn't need the British courts. That's what parasitic thinking is.
Yeah, I mean, I did notice, I think it was even this morning, you responding to somebody. I'm not going to say his name because I've never heard of him and there's no reason to give him airtime, but he made the statement, I don't think people quite understand the danger of linking
Yes,
woman and man legally back to biological sex. It is truly some dark shit.
it is. It's very dark. I mean, imagine, to think that when I decided to marry my wife, I presumed that she was female and that that would be the optimal way for us to, what's that word called? Oh, reproduce. Uh, that was just complete happenstance. It was because I believed in this transphobic idea that I shouldn't mate with women with penises. And it was through that happenstance that I ended up having children. But had I not been parasitized by transphobia, I would still be trying to attempt to mate with a woman with a penis.
Um, I'll turn it back over to Kimberly, but I do have more questions later.
So
Go
I
ahead.
do have a question for you. I don't know if this is new, and maybe you can answer that as part of this as well. But there seems to be at least a growing trend where, with these particularly pernicious ideas, that these groups of people or these individuals who choose to be parts of these groups of people want to be identified solely based on whatever label they've chosen. So if they decide that they're trans and they've joined this group, then that's all there is to them as a person. Um, so my question is, do you see that as a new trend, or is it just more pronounced because we have social media? And then also, where do we go from here? Where we're basically taking an entire complex person and breaking them down, at least by their choosing, into one tiny aspect or preference or delusion or whatever it is, and they're surrounding and basing their entire identity based on this one tiny little trait.
Look, the fact that human beings like to engage in identity formation in defining their personhood is something that exists since time immemorial. But to your point, I think that what made the West great is that it promoted the idea of individual identity, individual dignity over belongingness to a collective tribe, right? So people now often hear me talk about, I'm Lebanese Jewish, I'm Lebanese Jewish. But really, that's to your point, a very, very, it is only relevant now because of the zeitgeist that we're in. But you could have gone back to my previous public engagements 15 or 20 years ago, and I would have never mentioned that I'm Jewish or not. It's because the ones who want to kill me care about my Judaism that I now have to mention being Jewish. I present myself to the world as Gad Saad, and I'm a collection of hopefully many good qualities and hopefully not too many bad qualities. And I wish for you to judge me based on the totality of those traits. Once you lose that reflex to elevate the individual dignity of a person over some irrelevant either tribal or collective marker. I'm trans, I'm Muslim, I'm this, I'm that. It doesn't lead to good places. And as I said earlier, that's what happens in Syria. That's what happens in Rwanda. That's what happened in the Balkans. That's what happened in, of course, Lebanon. It's never good when collectivism supersedes, sublimates individual identity. So, for all sorts of reasons, I agree with you, and I think it's tragic.
Talk to me about academia. Wood cricket, parasite, combination of the two, your experience. I have my own, and I've spoken a lot about it. But
Sure.
what role has academia played in the trajectory that we're on?
Well, all of the parasitic ideas that I discuss in my work, and certainly in the parasitic mind, all of them, every single one of them, were originally spawned on university campuses because to kind of channel George Orwell's sentiment, it uniquely takes intellectuals to come up with some of the dumbest ideas. And now the answer is, the question is, well, why? How could it be that, objectively intelligent, educated people called professors can come up with dumb ideas? And I think I've got a pretty compelling answer. It's because oftentimes the ones who are the originators of those parasitic ideas are fully decoupled from the autocorrective mechanisms of reality, right? I mean, that's why many of those ideas originally flourish in some esoteric humanities department. It's not coincidental that the least likely places where you saw these parasitic ideas in academia were traditionally not fully inoculated, but traditionally much less so in the business school and in the engineering school, because you can't really build bridges using feminist architecture, and you can't really build bridges using postmodernist physics, just like you can't build economic models that either make you a lot of money or make you lose a lot of money using postmodernist econometrics, because those fields are wedded to reality. There is an autocorrective slap in your face if you espouse nonsense. But if I am in intersectional underwater lesbian dance therapy, then I can engage in this kind of pontification in front of a bunch of completely gullible students, and they all look at me and say, wow, what profound nonsense you must be spewing, professor. It must be I'm too dumb to understand it. That's how the postmodernists, by the way, got through with all of their nonsense. Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, who are three of the big French postmodernist bullshitters, I think that that's exactly how they got away with all that they got away with, which is they get up in front of an audience, they literally spew a concatenation of gibberish nonsense, and now the audience member has to decide, am I not understanding what they're saying because they're full of doo-doo, or is it because I'm too dumb? And most people end up saying, oh, it must be I'm too dumb because surely a professor couldn't be espousing nonsense. And so all of the bad ideas that I discuss, Bill, stem from academia, regrettably. Every last one.
So I do want to go back to your book, The Parasitic Mind. Again, I have just nothing but praise for this book. Even if you think you know a lot about pernicious ideology and the detrimental impact it's having on the West and culture and ideas in general, this is something you need to read. Can you tell us how did this book come to be?
Well, remember earlier I was talking about the two great wars I faced, the war in Lebanon and the war on reason. So it's really a book that's been writing, simmering in my head for much of the past 30 years, because what started off early in my career as me noticing that fellow social scientists did not agree that human beings are biological beings, and I would stop and say, well, "What do you mean? How could you think that we're not biological beings? What else are we? What did they study in medical school? They study that we're not biological beings." And so, and it just accelerated from there. I would be sitting on granting committees where we decide who's going to get a grant, and the grants were on queer mathematics and queer architecture and feminist whatever. And so it's difficult to not be exposed to this nonsense if you are in academia, because as I mentioned earlier, all of this nonsense started in academia. Now, I should mention it. This is not to imply that everybody in academia is insane. Absolutely not. But it doesn't take many people to ruin it for everybody else, right? So I remind people that how many people did it take to bring down the Twin Towers? It was only 19 people. It wasn't 19 million people, right? And so by the same token, it doesn't take too many unhinged ideologues to completely muddle the waters of reason in an academic setting. And so that's what I decided, that okay, I need to document all this. I need to explain where all of these bad ideas come from. And then towards the end of the book, I hopefully offer an effective mind vaccine against this lunacy.
No, I really enjoyed it. And I mean, it's one of those that I know that I will go back and read through periodically too, because it's one that you just need to digest a little bit and then go back and read again and digest a little bit more. Um, so yes, again, if you haven't read it, definitely be sure to check it out. You can find it on Amazon and all the usual places.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind words.
So the question I have, because I know we're getting towards the end, is it too late? Is it too late for Western civilization? Have we become so zombified, so paralyzed, that we can't turn back? Have we crossed the point of no return?
Part of me wants to always have an optimistic outlook, and part of me is wedded to reality. And not to imply that if I'm optimistic, I'm ignoring reality. So let me answer it in two ways. I think that, remember the original tweet you put up, in 500 years, you're going to have war. So there will be an autocorrection. That autocorrection, regrettably, will come in the form of violence. One of the things that I've been trying to warn people is that people will wake up. The question is, depending on when they wake up, will determine whether it will largely be a peaceful autocorrection or a violent one. So to answer your question very broadly, I think that it could potentially not be too late, but it's certainly, in my view, too late for peaceful autocorrection. In other words, the problem will now continue to fester and worsen. And when people truly wake up, when the average person truly gets their head out of the proverbial sand, there'll be no other way to react other than through violence. Now, some of the idea pathogens can be resolved without any violence, right? So, for example, we already see that the zeitgeist is no longer very open to people putting gender pronouns in their bios, right? Even the very committed wokesters are quietly removing he, him, and she, they, whatever it is, right? So that's one way by which we get rid of some of the nonsense without any shots being fired. But when it comes, for example, to open door immigration policies where millions of people have come to the West from societies that couldn't be more antithetical to the West, how are you going to coexist? I mean, unless those people reject their religious and cultural heritage in order to assimilate to the West, there is no other outcome other than eventual violence. But that's why when I put that tweet up that you mentioned at the start of our show, I couldn't give you an exact timeline because that will determine on when people will wake up. So will people wake up? Yes, that's the optimistic part, but they will wake up. It will be violence. That's the pessimistic part.
Okay, so I have quoted you, I have quoted Reagan. Now I'm going to quote Lenin from his
Okay.
famous from his famous pamphlet Что делать. I did speak Russian fluently at one point in my life, not anymore. What is to be done?
Uh, you mean, so what is it that we can do to try
Yes.
to create it? So here is part of why the tweet that you mentioned and a series of other tweets that I've put up that constitute part of my, what I call my somber tweets. The reason why I call them somber is because usually people ascribe to me, being very jovial. And even when I'm talking about very serious topics, right, I'm funny and humorous. People call me the happy warrior. But I've started putting up more and more somber tweets because my feeling is that the West doesn't have the stomach to implement the types of autocorrections that could solve the problem. So that's why I hesitated between optimism and pessimism. There is a pathway by which you solve the problem, but I simply don't think the West has the ability to do it. So let's take, for example, Canada. Canada right now is about to face a federal election, and we've just come out of 9 years of Justin Trudeau. By every conceivable metric by which a society is judged, on any metric you want, we are astoundingly worse. And yet many Canadians are saying, when I tell them, so who are you voting for in the next election? Oh, liberals, because I'm a liberal person, Professor Saad. So how could it be that you've just gotten 9 years of data that suggests that you might want to revise your political behavior, and yet you're fully anchored in being non-malleable in your political behavior? So I think that's, so I can offer you a solution of what to do next. Well, here's what you do next. Not a single person who practices an ideology that is in any way contrary to the Western foundational values has a right to be in the West. Do you think that that's going to be implemented, given the original question you asked me about freedom of religion? I fear not. And so in the abstract, there are many things that we can do. Pragmatically, I fear that we won't, and therefore prepare for what I call collective seppuku. Seppuku is a ritual suicide that the Japanese practice. Well, we're going to commit collective seppuku under the name of suicidal empathy, which is the topic of the current book that I'm working on.
Or we're going to become Beirut, and
Or we're going to become Beirut.
Somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose, and maybe that's where we're heading. Well, I thank you so much for taking the time. I've learned a lot. Every time I read anything you've written, I've watched a lot of your videos. I really learn a lot, and I can only imagine what you must go through. I mean, I stopped picking up my phone at the office in 2009. Okay, so I understand it, and that's not an exaggeration. That's actually true. And we thank you for being so bold, for telling people the truth, for being willing to try to alert people to what is coming based in part on your personal experience. And we thank you a lot, and we hope that all of the people watching this will buy your books and retweet you, and more than anything, realize what's happening.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure. Keep doing your great work. Thank you. Cheers.
Yes, thank you.
Take care.
Take care, guys. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.